They said teaching them to read was a crime. They said letters were dangerous. Words were weapons. Knowledge was rebellion. In the early 1800s, across the southern states of the United States, laws were passed making it illegal to teach enslaved black people how to read or write. If caught, teachers would be fined, imprisoned, beaten. Enslaved students could be whipped, sold, disappeared, because literacy meant power, and power threatened the system. But what slave owners didn't understand was this. When you deny someone light, they learn to see in the dark, at night. After the fields went quiet and the overseers returned home, whispers traveled between cabins. A knock, a coat at him, a flicker of lantern light behind a covered window, somewhere beneath a church floor, somewhere inside a barn, somewhere deep in the woods. A school would begin. No desks, no chalkboards, no textbooks, just a Bible, a scrap of newspaper, a piece of charcoal, and courage. Children as young as 6, elders as old as 60, hands rough from cotton fields tracing letters into dirt floors, voices barely above a whisper repeating the alphabet like prayer. A, B, C. Each letter carried risk. Each word defied chains. And standing before them, sometimes a free black preacher, sometimes a secretly literate enslaved man, sometimes even a white abolitionist risking everything, was someone who believed one thing: freedom begins in the mind. This is not just a story about secret classrooms. It is a story about rebellion disguised as education. It is a story of how underground schools became the first battlefields of liberation, because before emancipation was written into law, it was written on slate boards in candlelight. Before marches filled streets, children gathered in basements. Before speeches shook capitals, whispers shook plantations. They tried to bury education underground. But underground is where roots grow strongest. And from those hidden schools, a generation would rise. Leaders, writers, preachers, thinkers, who would carry the fight for freedom forward long after chains were broken. This is the story of the classroom's history tried to erase. The fear of black literacy did not begin with kindness. It began with control. In 1740, after the Stono Rebellion in South Carolina, slave codes were tightened. Lawmakers believed rebellion spread not just through anger, but through communication. If enslaved people could read pamphlets, maps, scripture, newspapers, they could organize, plan, escape. By the early 1800s, state after state across the American South passed laws banning the education of enslaved people. After Nat Turner's rebellion in 1831, the crackdown intensified. Teaching an enslaved person to read could lead to heavy fines, imprisonment, or violence. Plantation owners understood something clearly. A literate mind could not be permanently enslaved. On a plantation in Georgia, a boy named Samuel first saw a book when he was 9. It belonged to the plantation owner's son. Samuel wasn't meant to touch it. He wasn't meant to look at it. But he noticed something strange. The boy moved his eyes across the page, and meaning appeared. Samuel didn't know what letters were yet, but he understood power when he saw it. That night, in the slave quarters, he asked an elder named Ruth, "What are those marks?" Ruth froze. She had learned secretly decades earlier from the daughter of a former master who had pitted her. She knew her letters. She also knew the cost. "Those marks," she whispered carefully, "are keys." Keys to what? To doors they don't want us opening. Ruth had not read in years. Fear had buried the habit. But when she saw Samuel's curiosity, something stirred inside her, something older than fear. Hope. The first lesson began with dust. In the corner of her cabin, when the others slept, Ruth drew a single line in the dirt floor. "This," she said, "is A." Samuel repeated it, again and again. Outside, the night insects sang. Wind moved through wooden boards. Every sound felt like danger. Every creak like footsteps approaching. But nothing happened. The next night, they added B. Within weeks, 3 more children joined. Then 5. They never met the same way twice. Sometimes in Ruth's cabin. Sometimes behind the smokehouse. Sometimes in the woods where trees swallowed sound. No paper. No ink. Just dirt and memory. Word spread quietly. An older man named Isaiah, who worked near the main house, began bringing discarded newspaper scraps. Most were torn, smudged, incomplete, but they were treasure. The students would stare at printed words like they were staring at the face of God. "What does this one say?" Samuel would ask. Ruth would squint in candlelight. Freedom. The word hung heavy in the air. They didn't fully understand it yet, but they knew it was important. Meanwhile, the plantation owner noticed something subtle. The enslaved children seemed attentive, listening differently, watching more closely. Suspicion began to grow. One evening, a patrol rode to the quarters unexpectedly. Doors flung open, bedding overturned. Questions barked harshly. Ruth's heart pounded so loudly she thought it would give her away. Beneath her sleeping mat lay a folded scrap of newspaper. If they found it, but the patrol moved on. That night, Ruth considered stopping the lessons. Fear pressed hard against her resolve. But when Samuel arrived again the next evening, eyes bright, whispering, "What comes after C?" she knew she couldn't quit, because something irreversible had begun. Within months, Samuel could read small sentences. Isaiah began practicing writing letters using charcoal on flat stones. An older woman named Clara learned to spell her own name for the first time at age 50. And something else changed. They stood differently. When scripture was read aloud during supervised church gatherings, they followed along in their minds. When slave codes were posted publicly, they began to understand the words used to confine them. Knowledge did not remove chains, but it weakened the lie that chains were natural. The underground school grew not because it was safe, but because it was necessary. And across the South, similar secret gatherings were forming. In hidden church basements, in forests, in attics, in cellars, education became quiet resistance. Each letter was an act of defiance, each sentence a rebellion. And though the law tried to suffocate literacy, it could not extinguish hunger, because once someone learns that marks on a page carry meaning, they can never return to silence. The lessons did not stay small for long. What began in Ruth's cabin as lines drawn in dust slowly became something larger than any one plantation could contain. Across the South, in places scattered through Georgia, South Carolina, Virginia, and Mississippi, similar quiet rebellions were unfolding under cover of darkness. The enslaved understood something their captors feared deeply. Information traveled faster than chains to restrain it. Spiritual gatherings became the perfect disguise. On Sundays, when enslaved families were permitted supervised worship, plantation owners believed hymns kept minds docile. But beneath those hymns, messages moved like currents beneath calm water. A song about crossing the Jordan was not just scripture, it was direction. A lyric about chariots coming home was not just faith, it was code. And in hidden moments before or after worship, letters were traced into palms. Words whispered ear to ear. Sounds practiced in breaths so quiet they barely disturbed the air. Samuel's small circle grew into nearly 20 learners, their ages ranging from children to elders whose backs were bent from decades in the fields. Isaiah began memorizing passages from scraps of newspapers and repeating them aloud until others could recite them too. Memory became their textbook. When paper was too dangerous to keep, they carried words in their minds. And something remarkable happened. Literacy sharpened awareness. They began to recognize plantation ledgers left open, to understand prices listed beside human names, to read notices about auctions days before overseers announced them. Knowledge did not erase cruelty, but it stripped away the illusion of mystery that slaveholders relied upon. Control depended on secrecy. Literacy cracked open. The risk intensified after 1831. When Nat Turner's rebellion shook Virginia and sent shockwaves through the entire South. Legislatures responded swiftly, passing harsher laws that banned not only teaching enslaved people, but also restricting free black communities from operating schools. Patrols increased. Suspicion thickened. In Samuels County, new fines were posted for anyone caught educating the enslaved. $500 and possible jail time. For enslaved students, the punishment could mean public whipping or being sold south to harsher plantations. Fear pressed heavy, but something else pressed harder: resolve. Ruth knew stopping now would mean surrendering the one weapon they had managed to forge. Instead of shrinking, the network adapted. Lookouts were assigned. Meeting locations rotated constantly. Lessons were shortened but more frequent. They practiced writing not only letters but maps, rough sketches of rivers and roads memorized quickly and then erased. A free black preacher named Reverend Elijah began traveling between plantations under the pretense of conducting authorized worship. Hidden inside his worn Bible were tiny slips of paper containing alphabets and short reading passages. He would leave them behind like seeds, trusting they would be memorized and destroyed before patrols arrived. Under candlelight in barns and forest clearings, children repeated words that sounded like prophecy. Liberty, rights, dignity, vote. They did not yet possess those things, but naming them made them real, in imagination first. And imagination was dangerous. Plantation owners noticed subtle shifts. Enslaved workers were no longer confused by contracts or announcements. They asked sharper questions. They hesitated before signing marks on documents they could not read before. The master sensed something changing, but could not see it clearly. Knowledge had no visible chains to confiscate. It moved silently between minds. One evening, patrol riders discovered a hidden lesson in a neighboring plantation. The teacher, an older enslaved man, was beaten severely. 2 students were sold away within the week. The news traveled fast, carried through coded song and whispered warning. Fear surged through Samuel's group like cold water. Some families pulled their children back. Terrified, Ruth gathered the remaining students and spoke plainly. She did not romanticize the danger. She did not promise safety. She simply asked, "If we stop, what do they win?" Silence filled the cabin. Then Clara, the woman who had learned to spell her name at 50, answered softly, "They win our minds." That night, they continued, but the tone changed. It was no longer just curiosity driving them. It was defiance. Each lesson felt urgent, purposeful. Samuel began teaching younger children what he had already mastered, spreading knowledge so no single arrest could erase it. The underground school was no longer dependent on one teacher. It had become a network. In nearby counties, similar systems emerged. Free black artisans teaching apprentices after hours, littered enslaved house servants sharing newspaper headlines overheard in parlors, white abolitionists quietly supplying books at enormous personal risk. The system built to suppress black intellect had underestimated one truth: hunger for knowledge multiplies under pressure. The more literacy was outlawed, the more sacred it became. And beneath the surface of enforced ignorance, roots were spreading. Not loud, not visible, but strong. Freedom was no longer a distant rumor. It was being spelled, syllable by syllable, in cabins and forests across the South. And though chains still clanged in daylight, at night letters glowed brighter than fear. The underground schools were no longer isolated sparks. They were becoming a hidden fire, moving quietly beneath the foundations of slavery itself. By the time winter settled over plantations, literacy was no longer simply an act of curiosity or quiet rebellion. It had become strategy. What began as letters traced in dirt had grown into something sharper, more deliberate. Samuel was no longer just a student. He was a teacher in his own right, guiding younger children to the alphabet with the same patience Ruth had once shown him. The underground school had shifted from fragile experiment to organized resistance. They had learned to rotate meeting times, to scatter in seconds if a dog barked too close, to burn scraps of paper so thoroughly that even ash could not betray them. But more importantly, they had begun to understand what reading truly unlocked. It unlocked information, and information could shift power. News traveled slowly on plantations, filtered and controlled by those who owned both land and bodies. But literate minds could gather fragments, half-read newspapers discarded by masters, overheard conversations in the big house, public notices nailed to posts in town, and piece them together like a puzzle. They learned about debates in northern states where abolitionists were growing louder. They learned about escaped men and women who had followed the North Star to freedom. They learned that slavery was not an unchangeable law of nature, but a system defended by human hands and human fear. That realization alone was revolutionary. If a system was built by people, it could be dismantled by people. Isaiah began memorizing articles about political arguments over slavery's expansion into new territories. He would return from the main house with fragments committed to memory, then recite them word for word beneath the dim lantern light. The group listened like scholars gathered at a hidden university. For the first time, they understood that forces beyond the plantation gates were shifting. This was not just about survival. It was about timing. Meanwhile, suspicion among slaveholders deepened. Overseers noticed that certain enslaved workers seemed less easily deceived. They questioned contradictory instructions. They calculated work quotas more precisely. They whispered together with unusual intensity. Knowledge had changed posture. It had straightened backs and sharpened eyes. The masters could not see books in their hands, but they felt the difference in the air. Patrols intensified again. Random inspections became frequent. Rumors spread of harsher crackdowns in neighboring counties. One night, riders stormed a plantation only miles away, dragging two men from a barn where letters had been found carved into wood. The men were whipped publicly as warning. The message was clear. Literacy would be punished like rebellion, and yet the punishment proved the point. If letters were so feared, then letters held power. Ruth gathered the group after hearing the news. Candlelight flickered against faces tightened by anger and fear. "They think pain will erase what we've learned," she said quietly. "But pain cannot unteach the mind." Her words settled heavily, but they were true. Knowledge, once gained, could not be beaten out without breaking the spirit entirely. And their spirits, though wounded, were not broken. The underground network adapted again. They reduced group size and began pairing students so learning could continue even if gatherings were disrupted. Samuel taught two younger boys during daylight while pretending to work near the smokehouse, disguising lessons as idle conversation. Clara began teaching women in the fields by singing altar hymns where certain words corresponded to letters. Even Reverend Elijah refined his method, embedding simple spelling patterns into sermons so congregants could practice silently without raising suspicion. Education had evolved into something almost invisible. It lived in rhythm, memory, code. Then came the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, tightening the grip nationwide, and increasing fear among free black communities as well. Even in northern states, escaped individuals were no longer safe. The news, when it reached the underground students, hit hard. Some had quietly dreamed of running. Now the path seemed narrower. But literacy again transformed despair into strategy. They studied maps more carefully. They memorized geography. They analyzed which routes had fewer patrols. Knowledge did not guarantee freedom, but ignorance guaranteed captivity. Samuel, now a young man, began to think beyond the plantation. If war came, as whispers suggested it might, the ability to read orders, understand movements, and communicate secretly would matter. The underground schools were not merely teaching survival. They were preparing a generation for leadership in a world not yet born, and that world crept closer each year. By the late 1850s, tension between North and South felt like dry timber waiting for a spark. Abolitionist newspapers grew bolder. Southern legislatures grew harsher. The enslaved, listening carefully, sensed the approaching storm. Within the hidden classroom, lessons grew more urgent. Writing practice shifted toward names and signatures. Because one day contract would matter, reading shifted toward scripture passages about deliverance and justice. Because hope needed language. And always, beneath it all, pulsed a shared understanding. They were no longer simply victims of a system. They were thinkers within it. The greatest lie slavery depended on was a lie of intellectual inferiority. Every letter mastered shattered that lie. Every sentence read dissolved it further. The underground schools had done more than teach literacy. They had restored identity. And as America edged toward civil war, those quiet classrooms, lit by candles, guarded by courage, were shaping minds that would step into a new era ready not just to be freed, but to define freedom itself. The storm they had whispered about finally broke in 1861. When the Civil War erupted in the United States, plantations trembled with uncertainty. Masters who once carried absolute authority now spoke in anxious tones about battles, troop movements, and the threat of invasion. Enslaved men were forced to build fortifications. Food supplies shifted. Overseers grew harsher, sensing that control was slipping through their fingers. But within the quarters, something else stirred, something that felt dangerously close to hope. For years, The underground schools had prepared minds quietly. Now history itself was moving, and those prepared minds were ready to interpret it. Samuel, no longer a boy tracing letters in dust, listened closely to every fragment of news he could gather. Because he could read, he no longer relied solely on overheard gossip. He pieced together truth from newspapers discarded by anxious slaveholders. He learned the names of generals, the locations of battles, the shifting tides of war. And when he returned to the hidden gatherings at night, he translated that information into understanding for others. The war was not just distant thunder. It was a crack forming in the walls of slavery. In 1863, when word of the Emancipation Proclamation spread, slowly, unevenly, and often distorted, it reached Samuel's plantation not as a clear announcement, but as rumor carried by Union soldiers moving through nearby counties. Some masters denied it, others dismissed it, but literate minds searched for confirmation. Samuel finally held a tattered newspaper weeks later that contained the official declaration. By candlelight, he read aloud the words that declared enslaved people in rebelling states to be free. The cabin fell silent, except for the sound of breathing thick with disbelief. Freedom, written in ink. It did not instantly change their physical reality. Chains did not fall that night, but something internal shifted permanently. The law that once outlawed their literacy had been countered by a new law recognizing their humanity. Knowledge allowed them to grasp the significance immediately. Without literacy, the proclamation would have been rumor. With literacy, it became documented truth. As Union troops advanced deeper into the South, many enslaved men fled plantations to join their lines. Samuel faced a decision. Staying meant protecting the fragile school network that had sustained them. Leaving meant fighting for promise he had just read aloud. Ruth, older now and physically weaker, placed a hand on his shoulder. "You learned so one day you could choose," she told him. "Now choose." Samuel left before dawn, carrying no books, only memory. He joined a United States Colored Troops regiment where, once again, literacy proved powerful. He could read written orders. He could help fellow soldiers understand pay documents. He could write letters home from men who had never been taught. In camp tents, he found himself teaching again, this time openly, without whispers, without lookouts posted in trees. The transformation felt unreal. What had once required secrecy was now encouraged among Union lines. Meanwhile, back on the plantation, Ruth and the others continued holding lessons despite the chaos. The war created gaps in supervision as masters traveled or worried about conscription. They used those gaps wisely. Children learned to sign their names in anticipation of contracts that might one day define their labor. Women practiced reading scripture aloud with steady voices, no longer whispering quite as softly. When Union forces finally passed near their county, enslaved families stepped forward cautiously, uncertain but determined. The official end of the war in 1865 and the ratification of the 13th Amendment legally abolished slavery. The moment many had risked their lives preparing for had arrived. But freedom was not a doorway one simply walked through. It was terrain that had to be navigated. Formerly enslaved people were suddenly expected to negotiate wages, sign contracts, understand laws, and advocate for themselves in courts that had long denied their humanity. Here, the underground schools revealed their deepest impact. Those who had learned in secret stepped into this uncertain world with an advantage no chain could erase. Clara signed her own labor contract rather than marking it with an X. Isaiah read posted announcements about land opportunities and warned others about exploitative terms. And when the Freedmen's Bureau began establishing official schools during Reconstruction, they found eager students who were not beginning from nothing. They were continuing what had already started in barns and cabins years before. Samuel returned after the war, uniform worn but eyes bright. The plantation he left had changed hands. Slavery was gone, but hostility lingered in new forms. Still, he carried something unstoppable, education paired with experience. Together with Reverend Elijah and others, he helped establish one of the first formal schools for freed children in the county. This time, the doors were not hidden. The windows were not covered. Lessons were held in daylight. Yet everyone inside understood something profound. This visible school had roots underground. It had been nourished in fear, protected by courage and strengthened through secrecy. War had opened a legal door to freedom. But it was the underground schools that prepared a generation to walk through it with dignity and readiness. The chains had broken, but the real revolution had begun long before the first cannon fired. Freedom did not arrive as a celebration. It arrived as uncertainty wrapped in fragile hope. When the Civil War ended in 1865 and slavery was formally abolished in the United States, millions of formerly enslaved people stood at the edge of a future they had imagined for years in whispers and candlelight. The chains were legally gone, but nothing else was simple. Land did not suddenly belong to them. Protection did not automatically surround them. The same soil that had witnessed their bondage now watched them attempt to define freedom for themselves. And at the center of that struggle stood education. The underground schools that once hid in cabins and forests now stepped cautiously into daylight. What had been secret rebellion became open declaration. We will learn. Across southern states, freed families gathered broken boards, discarded bricks, and leftover nails to build their own schoolhouses. Some were no more than one-room structures with dirt floors and gaps in the walls. But to those who entered, they were sanctuaries. Samuel returned from the war changed, not only by battle, but by exposure. He had seen black soldiers read military orders, calculate supplies, and write letters home. He had witnessed literacy function openly, without fear of patrol riders bursting through doors. Now, back in his county, he understood that the real battle had shifted. Freedom without education would leave them vulnerable to new forms of exploitation. He joined others in establishing a formal school, built partly with assistance from the Freedmen's Bureau, but sustained primarily by the community's own labor. Every plank hammered into place carried the memory of nights when even whispering the alphabet had been dangerous. The first day the school opened, it filled beyond capacity. Children pressed shoulder to shoulder on benches. Elderly men who had once bent beneath cotton sacks now bent over slates practicing shaky signatures. Women who had been forbidden from holding books traced letters slowly, lips moving as if tasting each word. The hunger was overwhelming. For years, literacy had symbolized resistance. Now it symbolized survival. Contracts needed to be read before being signed. Wages needed to be counted. Laws needed to be understood. But even as classrooms filled, resistance rose in a different form. Many white Southerners viewed black education not as progress, but as threat. The same fear that had fueled anti-literacy laws during slavery returned, reshaped but intact. Armed groups began forming. Night riders determined to intimidate freed communities. Schools were among their first targets. Windows were shattered. Walls were burned. Teachers were threatened. Some white teachers from the North who had come south to assist faced harassment or violence. Black teachers faced even greater risk. One evening, Samuel arrived at the schoolhouse to find a crude warning nailed to the door. Books won't make you equal. The message was clear. Education was still perceived as rebellion. And in truth, it was not rebellion against law now, but against a racial hierarchy determined to survive slavery's death. The community responded not with retreat, but with resolve. Night watches were organized. Men rotated guarding the schoolhouse with whatever weapons they could find. Women gathered funds quietly to replace damaged materials. When one school was burned in a neighboring county, families rebuilt it within weeks. The act of rebuilding became a statement. Destruction would not erase determination. Clara, now elderly but sharp-eyed, volunteered to teach younger children basic reading, while Samuel handled advanced lessons. Isaiah focused on arithmetic, teaching former field hands how to calculate fair wages and recognize dishonest accounting. Literacy was expanding into full education. Reading, writing, mathematics, civic understanding. Students learned about the Constitution and the amendments granting citizenship and voting rights. For the first time, they studied a system that had once excluded them. Knowledge no longer hid beneath floorboards. It stood at the front of the classroom. But hostility intensified as Reconstruction governments attempted to enforce black civil rights. Paramilitary groups like the Ku Klux Klan emerged, using terror to suppress political participation and intimidate educators. Churches and schools, often housed in the same buildings, became symbols of empowerment and therefore targets. Samuel understood the pattern clearly. Slavery had feared literacy because it nurtured independent thought. Reconstruction opponents feared literacy because it nurtured political agency. The battleground had shifted from ownership of bodies to control of opportunity. One winter night, riders approached the schoolhouse. This time, the community was ready. Guards signaled with lantern flashes, and families gathered quickly. The riders, seeing they were outnumbered and watched, retreated into darkness. It was a small victory, but it meant everything. For the first time, protection came not from secrecy but solidarity. The underground schools had once survived by hiding. Now their survival depended on unity. Students continued coming despite threats. Attendance sometimes doubled after an act of intimidation, as if danger itself reminded them why learning mattered. Parents who could barely write their names insisted their children master full sentences. They understood that education was inheritance, the one asset no former master could confiscate. By the 1870s, literacy rates among freed people began rising steadily. Colleges and institutions for black education were established across the South, many founded by those who had once studied secretly in bondage. The seeds planted in dirt-floor cabins were now growing into formal academies. Yet even as progress advanced, federal commitment to Reconstruction weakened. When political compromises in 1877 effectively ended Reconstruction protections, Southern states began imposing segregation laws and voter suppression measures. The promise of equality narrowed once more. But something fundamental had changed permanently. A generation raised in underground classrooms could not be returned to intellectual captivity. They understood contracts, ballots, newspapers. They organized mutual aid societies and political groups. They read about injustices and documented them. Education had done more than teach letters. It had reshaped identity. Samuel often reflected on those first nights with Ruth, tracing A in the dust while listening for patrols. He realized that what they built was not just literacy, but continuity. The fight had never been only about learning to read. It had been about claiming the right to interpret the world. Even as new systems of oppression emerged, they faced them armed with knowledge. Freedom was under siege, yes, but it was no longer defenseless. The underground schools had transformed into visible institutions, and though enemies still circled, the foundation could not be undone. Because once a people learned to read their own story, they refused to let others write it alone. By the time Reconstruction began to crumble in the late 1870s, many of the federal protections that had briefly shielded black communities were stripped away. Troops withdrew from the South. White supremacist governments regained political control. New laws, poll taxes, literacy tests twisted into weapons, segregation statutes rose like walls determined to contain black progress. It felt, to many, like history was trying to reverse itself. But something fundamental stood in the way of that reversal. The mind of a people who had already tasted knowledge. The underground schools had begun in secrecy, grown in courage, and survived open hostility. Now they entered their most difficult chapter, endurance without protection. Samuel had aged into a respected educator and community leader. The school he helped establish had weathered threats, fires, and intimidation. Yet funding grew scarce as Reconstruction governments fell. White-controlled legislatures redirected resources away from black institutions. Facilities deteriorated. Books were outdated. Classrooms were overcrowded. But the hunger for learning did not fade. If anything, hardship sharpened it. Parents reminded their children of nights when even whispering the alphabet had meant risking death. Compared to that, worn textbooks were a small obstacle. The irony was bitter. Literacy tests were now being used to deny black citizens the right to vote. The same skill once forbidden was now manipulated to exclude. Officials designed impossibly complex questions, administered unfairly, to suppress political power. But even this cruelty revealed something powerful. The system still feared educated black minds. It feared organization. Years passed, and the world shifted again. Reconstruction faded into memory. Promises once spoken loudly in the halls of the United States government were slowly weakened by compromise and indifference. New laws rose like barriers, segregation enforced by custom and statute, opportunities narrowed by design. For many black families across the South, it felt as if the door that had briefly opened after the Civil War was being pushed shut once more. But But something powerful refused to retreat, the light that had been lit in secret decades earlier. Samuel no longer moved with the urgency of youth. His hair had silvered, and his hands bore the marks of both field labor and chalk dust. Yet his voice remained steady when he stood before his students. The schoolhouse that once faced threats now stood as a fixture in the community. Its wood had been replaced and reinforced over the years. Its windows had been shattered and repaired. Its walls had heard whispers of fear and shouts of celebration. It had survived because the people within it understood something profound. Education was not a season. It was a legacy. Children who filled the benches no longer remembered slavery firsthand. They had been born into a world where freedom, though fragile, was their starting point. But Samuel made sure they knew the story, not to burden them with pain, but to anchor them in purpose. He told them about Ruth tracing letters in dirt under the threat of whips. He told them about in books that carried hidden alphabets. He told them about nights when candle flames were shielded by trembling hands, because even light could betray them. The children listened wide-eyed, tried to imagine a time when reading itself was rebellion. Outside the school walls, segregation signs were beginning to appear in towns and train stations. Black voters faced intimidation, and complex tests designed to silence them. Economic opportunities were limited by systems meant to keep wealth out of black hands. It was clear that freedom alone had not erased prejudice. But inside the classroom, something revolutionary continued quietly. Students debated ideas. They wrote essays. They studied history. Not just a version handed to them, but the fuller story of resistance and resilience. Literacy had once been about survival. Now it was about voice. Clara had passed on peacefully years earlier, but her impact lingered in every hymn still sung at community gatherings. Isaiah had gone on to help establish neighboring schools, carrying the underground spirit into new counties. The network that once existed in secret now stretched visibly across regions. Teachers training teachers, parents insisting on education for daughters as well as sons, communities raising funds for better books and stronger buildings. The flame had spread. One afternoon, Samuel watched as a young girl named Lila stood before the class and read aloud from a newspaper article discussing new laws being debated in the state legislature. Her voice did not tremble. She paused at complex words, sounding them out confidently. When she finished, she lifted her head and asked a question about fairness, about rights, about what citizens deserved. The room filled with thoughtful silence. Samuel felt something tighten in his chest. Not fear, not anger, but pride. This was what the underground schools had truly created. Thinkers. Even when schools for black children received less funding than white institutions, even when textbooks arrived secondhand and worn, the determination inside those classrooms remained fierce. Parents who had once been denied education entirely now worked long hours to ensure their children could attend daily. They knew that knowledge was inheritance. Land could be taken, jobs could be restricted, but the ability to read, to reason, to write, that could travel anywhere. On the anniversary of emancipation, the community gathered outside the schoolhouse for a celebration. Elders shared stories. Children recited poems. A choir sang the same spirituals that once disguised secret lessons, but now their voices carried openly into the evening sky. Samuel stood quietly at the edge of the crowd, watching lantern light flicker across familiar faces. He realized something powerful. The underground schools had never truly been about hiding. They had been about preparing minds for a day when secrecy would no longer be necessary. As darkness settled and stars appeared overhead, Samuel imagined Ruth standing beside him, her steady hands guiding his one small fingers through invisible letters in the air. The world had not become perfect. Injustice still lingered, reshaped and rebranded. But ignorance no longer held unquestioned power. The night that once tried to swallow their light had failed. Because light, once learned, cannot be unlearned. It cannot be burned away by torches or erased by laws. It passes from hand to hand, generation to generation. It becomes a teacher standing at a chalkboard, a child raising her hand, a community refusing silence. The underground schools had begun as whispers beneath fear. They ended as voices carried across time. And those storms would come again. The light they lit would outlive the night.